Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along today. It's very nice to come along to a university. As you can hear from the very kind introduction, I spent a lot of my first part of my career in universities. So and now I'm obviously been a civil servant for the last 6 years, but it's always nice to come back to universities and give a talk. Is it the other one? That one, yes. As you just heard, I'm about to kind of try and explain to you some of what goes on in the Government Office for Science, because it's kind of central part of the government, but it hides under the radar quite a lot, and a lot of people don't realise who it is or what we do. So this slide kind of encapsulates in one sentence what we do. We're there as a kind of expert body of science in the middle of government to make sure that policy making across all of government is informed by the very best evidence base. Two particular functions that we do. One is advise the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and that's not done by us personally, but by the person who leads the Government Office for Science, who is the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Mark Walport. So if the Prime Minister has any scientific question, he can ring up Sir Mark on his phone and ask him a scientific question. And they do meet occasionally and have chats about science. And I think for someone like David Cameron, it probably makes quite a bit of a change to have half an hour chatting about science and things like that, rather than the kind of more pressing other issues of the day. And the other thing, as I say, we do is ensure best quality scientific evidence across government. So that there is Sir Mark Walport, our boss, and he's the 11th Government Chief Scientific Advisor. And they started as a kind of outcome of the Second World War, is when they started, when the value of science was particularly noted. And initially they were all from Ministry of Defence, but now they're more civilian. And he, of course, if you don't know him, he's a medic by training and was previously the director of the Wellcome Trust before he became the GCSA. So these are some of the things that Go Science does, the bullets on the left-hand side you can see. So how do we make sure that government has the best quality evidence? Well, one of them is by liaising with academia and industry. That's very good. Why it's very good for me to come and speak to people like yourselves today, so that we get the very best quality research that's going on across the country in various universities and make sure that the policymakers are aware of it. If you look at DEC, for example, where I used to come from, the policymakers are incredibly busy. They simply do not have time to look up and start reading academic papers or looking in Nature or anything like that. They rely on people like ourselves to provide that translation of scientific evidence to the policy making. Other things that we do in Government Office of Science is listed on this slide around skills, to making sure that the government has the right scientific skills, science and engineering. And I must stress engineering, because sometimes the engineering bit gets lost. We are as equally on the engineering side as we are on the science side in Government Office for Science. I suppose if it wasn't too long, we could almost call ourselves the Government Office for Science and Engineering, but I think that'd be a bit of a mouthful. So skills is very important, and also public engagement, and you'll hear a bit about that later. So on the skills side, this is the kind of structure, as it were, of the government science and engineering in the civil service. So at the bottom here we have one government chief scientific advisor, and then we have around 20 departmental chief scientific advisors. So each department has its own chief scientific advisor, and you probably just heard, you may have heard that DEC's just appointed a new chief scientific advisor, John Lovehead. Then we've got about 15,000, and we're never quite sure of the numbers of scientists in the civil service, because a lot of the time they don't identify themselves. A lot of the time they're not working in really scientific roles. So we do have a lot of closet scientists and engineers in the civil service. And we try and get them together in a community called GSE, and we have an annual conference. I could have gone back a bit to explain to you what that picture was. That picture, if you're wondering that picture, that's the government chief scientific advisor in a bubble hood in a level 4 containment. And down there is when he visited CAST, which is the part of the Home Office that does science on things like weapons and explosives and things like that. And so the value of science stretches right the way across from real science right down to policy making. So in some, not in the central government labs, but in the outside labs, like for example CAST, as I mentioned, or Health and Safety Laboratory, or many other food standards agency, there's real science being done, and DSTL is another one where there's real, hands-on science that's being done in the civil service. But in the central government departments, the scientists are more involved in providing advice to ministers on scientific issues. And Jenny here was a typical example of a government scientist in DEC, where she wasn't working on day-to-day science issues, but she was the central science team and was involved in giving advice on renewable heat to the policymakers in DEC on renewable heat issues. And she was closely linked to that. And she might tell you a little bit more about that later. So where does science have a role to play in government? Well, these are some of the issues that I've just put up here in terms of a graphical form, some of the issues where science is coming to bear in government. We have the ash cloud. That was released by the volcanoes in Iceland, and that was a fairly classic case of science advice to government. When was it safe for an airliner to travel over the Iceland? In what way did the ash cloud damage jet engines? So this is a case where the chief scientific advisor had to give direct advice to cabinet about the safety levels and was it really necessary for all flights across Europe to be grounded. The second one is the census, and that's looking at aging. We have a rapidly aging population in this country. What's the implications of an aging population going to be for the UK? Influenza vaccine, of course, this is the pandemic. That was particularly worrying a year or so ago, and is still on the risk register. Offshore wind, agriculture, and of course down here is the Thames Barrier, flooding, another area where scientific advice is absolutely essential in government. So that's on the kind of areas of policy that we work on. Now, the important thing to be aware of, and this is what Sir Mark likes to talk about, is when you're looking at these policy challenges, you have to look at it through several different lenses. And a very good example of that is the communications we work, which he spends a lot of time on climate change. He goes around giving talks about climate change and raising the profile of the issue of climate change around the UK. And you can see that depending on your perspective, you can view climate change very differently. Some people are like, 74% of people are concerned or fairly concerned about climate change. But that breaks down into several different categories. 79% of people are concerned more about the UK reducing its amount of fossil fuels it should use. 82% of the public, on the other hand, are more concerned about the UK being too dependent on energy from other countries. A lot of people misunderstand that we're not actually that dependent on Russia. Very little of our gas actually comes from Russia. But if you look in the Daily Mail and stuff like that, you'd get a totally different opinion of the amount of energy dependency we have on gas. So these are the concerns of the population. And then another lens you can view it from is affordability. A lot of people are very, very concerned about gas and electricity is costing a lot. But again, the description doesn't actually sometimes match the reality. We actually have some of the cheapest gas and electricity prices across the whole of Europe. But if you read the headlines in this country and some of what's been broadcast in the media, you'd get the sense that we've actually got some of the highest fuel prices. But that's actually not the case. So there are very many different lenses to view policy challenges through. I've mentioned science in an emergency a couple of times just now, and this is something else that GoScience does a lot of. We run the secretariat for this group, not ourselves, but our colleagues do in GoScience, called the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, called SAGE. And when there's an emergency, and you can see when it's been convened, 2009, 2010, 2011 and 2014 over the various emergencies, SAGE has been convened, and that brings together a whole load of experts from across academia and industry to come together and give direct advice to the PM and Cabinet through the COBRA briefing room, which you probably hear about on the news. And so this is convened at very short notice when we ever have an emergency that threatens the country, and that makes sure that the PM and the Cabinet has the very best quality advice. And though these experts are on standby, they've already identified, so for example, when there was a threat of a new explosion in volcanic explosion in Iceland, that might have released a new ash cloud, those academics were on standby to give immediate advice should it be necessary, and thankfully this time it wasn't necessary. So to do all of these functions that I've described what GoScience does, we work through a very, very wide range of partners and stakeholders. So we're in the middle down here, Government Office for Science. Here's the academics. Often we don't work with academics directly because we don't necessarily know who the right person to contact is. So we work through the learned societies, for example, the Royal Society or the British Academy. So we have relationships with them and we say, we need an expert on volcanoes or something like that. And then they would be able to tell us who the best person to come to speak to about volcanoes is. Obviously, we work for Cabinet Office, as I said, of the COBRA for emergencies. We work with a whole range of other government departments that I've talked about. And Jenny will later on will talk about the work that we do with DEC a lot in our team. And there is also international work we do. The Science and Innovation Network is a team of officials that are based in embassies and high commissions across the world. And they're co-located with their FCO colleagues, and they provide science and innovation support in embassies. So this is kind of some of the tools and the kind of range of work that we've done. I've already talked about the professions work that we do with the skills, and that's something I also do as a kind of side issue. I don't just work on energy, I also lead on the science and engineering part of the fast stream, which we're revising for next year's entry for getting a, rather than being a graduate entry scheme, the new science and engineering fast stream, it's going to be a postgraduate entry scheme. And we're looking for people with masters and PhDs who want to come into central government as scientists and engineers. There's the emergency one I talked about, SAGE, CST, the Council of Science and Technology, which Jenny will be talking about a little bit later, which provides some learned advice to the Prime Minister. Blackett reviews, these are reviews where there's got a kind of particular security element, and I'll be mentioning that in a minute about the one we're doing on the Internet of Things. Then there's the foresight work we do, which is really detailed 2-year projects to get a really in-depth scientific evidence on a particularly key issue. And horizon scanning, which is looking across to the future and see what issues might be coming out of the woodwork. The Go Science's various teams are arranged into various themes. You can see we're in the energy and climate change theme. I've got a colleague who's Amanda, who works particularly on climate change, but I kind of head up that whole theme. And you can see innovation, infrastructure, risk and resilience, and various other themes that run throughout Go Science. So this is an example of one of the themes. This is one of our foresight projects, Future of Aging. And this is a very big project that we're undertaking at the moment. As you can see, it's a 2-year project which will bring together a very substantial evidence base to inform government policy. And that's not just in the one department. It will cover Department of Work and Pensions, Department of Health, business department, many other departments where ageing society will have an impact on their working. Another big 2-year project on the foresight team is on cities, the future of cities. And they are again looking at how over the next 10 years cities will change and what that means for the country as a whole. And that is run into various subcategories, for example, buildings, transport, energy, water, infrastructure. We are, of course, liaising with them on the energy side of things, so we're working across with that team on that, and Jenny might pick that up a bit with the kind of cross-Go Science work that we're doing on that. Another one of the themes is data and analytics. This is big data, and this is some of the work that that team has been doing. Resilience Direct, this was a new visualization platform they put in place for emergencies, and that's the flooding. Before, the government, the cabinet, didn't have a very good visualization when they were in emergencies. So this was put together so that when COBRA was convened or some emergency committee, they had the very best visualization to help policymakers see things in a graphical, easy to understand format. And so this was an overlay of flooding information, so the information could be very readily apparent. There's also social media mapping. They did a project for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on that, and work with the London Fire Brigade as well on data and visualization. Another team in the Go Science looks at animal and plant health. This is another project, smaller than the foresight projects. The foresight ones are 2 years. I think this one, do you know, Jenny, how long this was? About a year-long project, was it? Probably about, it's slightly shorter than the foresight projects. And this has particularly come into the media recently. You can see that picture I got, that's an ash tree. And I'm sure everyone is aware of the ash dieback disease. So this is looking across animal and plant health, and it will also cover things like tuberculosis in cattle, of course, as well, which it covers across those type of things. I mentioned the Internet of Things is one of the recent Blackett reviews. The Prime Minister earlier this year at CBIT in a conference highlighted the potential of the Internet of Things as a new thing for the UK, a new technological revolution, and Britain should be part of it. So he commissioned a review on the Internet of Things, and that was due to be published very shortly in November, and again that's looking across many different sectors: transport, energy, healthcare, buildings and agriculture. And this is a common theme. Why would we do a project rather than an individual government department do a project? And the answer to that, when it's cross-cutting particularly, and that's where GoScience can take a role, being right in the centre of government. And again, as I was saying, just illustrating the cross-cutting nature of the Internet of Things reviews. Unfortunately, these days, when you have these logos up on a slide like this, it's very dull. In the old days, when I had a slide that like in government, every single department had their own individual logo. Like the Department of Children's Schools and Families had a beautiful kind of rainbow that everyone was building, this rainbow. Lovely logo, very inventive. But now, to cut costs, we all have to go on a uniform logo. The only thing that a department's allowed to choose now is the little colour bar on the left-hand side. And we're allowed to choose that. That's our gift. A lot of them have gone for kind of like certain shades of blue, where you can imagine the kind of Daily Mail headline in the future that a kind of government department has hired a colour consultant or something to decide upon the colour for its bar. Anyway. And lastly, as I say, the last slide here is our energy team at GoScience. And this is what we get up to. And I'm going to hand over to Jenny now just to tell you a little about what our team gets up to.
Great. So I work for Rupert on energy and GoScience. I guess the only other thing I would add to what you've already said, Rupert, if you don't mind, is that GoScience is in a unique position in that we don't report directly to a minister. That's quite unusual for government. Yeah. We report to the chief scientist, so it puts us in an interesting neutral position in government. So going through a little bit what the energy team does, four main themes, I guess. The first one is we commission research, and in doing so we're guided by the Council for Science and Technology. So the Council for Science and Technology is a group of independent experts. They're co-chaired by the Chief Scientist, and they provide independent technical advice to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. They provide advice on a whole range of issues, so they cover an enormous range, but they have a group that is specifically interested in energy, and we're the secretariat for them, and we work with them to develop and deliver projects. So we have 3 projects ongoing at the moment that are due to report in the next few months. I can't tell you too much about them because they're not published yet, but the general themes of them are one on following on from a previous project we've done on capacity margins, one looking at electricity resilience with respect to modelling, and the final one is looking at analysis of the political, technical, economic and social constraints affecting energy scenarios to 2050. So in doing those pieces of work, we work closely with learning bodies, groups like, that Rupert's already mentioned, so for example the Royal Academy of Engineering, as we have done in the past. So I've got 2 examples of projects here, a work we did in the past on shale gas and electricity capacity margin led by Royal Academy of Engineering and Royal Society. So if you're interested in the kind of projects we do, those are good examples to look at. Then the second thing is evidence collection across government. So we work very closely with different government departments. Energy, although led by the Department of Energy and Climate Change, DEC, energy policy does go into a lot of departments. So if you think about it, you've got the work that DEFRA does on the environment. Certainly energy infrastructure has an impact on the environment, so DEFRA has a strong interest in energy. Transport, obviously, communities and local government, with respect to planning, for example. There's all kinds of departments that have a strong interest in energy policy, and we work across government to help make sure that they're connected and that they all have access to the evidence that they need to underpin policy. The third, for example, I guess maybe if it's helpful, for example, we work on nuclear, we work on hydrogen, we work on bioenergy, we work on a lot of different topics. Third point is, Rupert mentioned the Chief Scientific Advisors Network. We tap into that as well, such a valuable resource. If they have a special group that focuses on energy, we support that group, and we work to bring to that group's attention major energy issues across government so that they can discuss it at a high level and then take action on the technical side of things where appropriate. The fourth thing I wanted to mention was that our group works, energy is an incredibly broad topic. there are two of us working on energy. Okay? What I mean by this is that we are not experts on energy. That isn't possible. In one of our major roles is to make sure that the chief scientist is briefed and up to date on energy issues. Given that we can't be experts on everything in energy, we rely quite a lot on having a good network. So we help departments, and I should say the chief scientist, connect to technical advice inside of government and outside of government, talking to nice people like yourselves who have expertise that we might not, that don't have. And we speak to industry. We engage widely with people who know a lot more than us on a wide range of topics to make sure that government has access to the information that it needs. So I guess those are the main points that I wanted to bring across.
I'll just add one more thing. The good advantage of having, like, the Royal Academy of Engineering doing that report on the capacity margin is that it's not a government report. The key thing is they're independent. So though we're commissioning that work, it is independent, and we're not steering what the results or outcome of that. And that's very useful in government sometimes, to have an independent report that can inform policy making but is not steered by government. So that's a kind of important point to make that. And the second point I just wanted to make is that whereas we seek advice, obviously from people like yourselves, the experts, it is bi-directional. So if you want to input into something in government, we're very happy to do that way as well. So if we're very happy to be contacted by people who want to input into policy making or want some explanation of policy making or feel that they can contribute. We're very happy to work as a kind of conduit in that way as well. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, questions, please. David first.
The balance between kind of sort of proactivity and reactivity. There was quite a few slides up front which seemed like you sat there and as soon as somebody asked you a question, you leapt into action and answered it.
Yes.
And how much of it is that being responsive to ministers' needs versus saying, hey guys, the world's about to end, we really ought to do something about this, kind of proactive pushing? So.
Yes, I mean, there's a balance, and I think the work on the slides illustrated that. There's the kind of reactive, which is the kind of emergencies type work, but I think the foresight work, we've got these 2-year, are the more the proactive. So we think it's an important area that there needs more scientific evidence on. It's not something where there's kind of an immediate urgency at the moment, like on cities, or on ageing, where we think there's going to be a problem. But we're putting together the evidence base in preparation for the questions that are going to be needed to be answered by policymakers over the coming years. So it's trying to get that balance.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say, sorry, I should be standing, shouldn't I? I would also say we have to be proactive in making, so one of our roles is to keep the chief scientist up to date on energy issues as they are unfolding, and it's good to be proactive to make sure he's aware of things right at the beginning. So there's a proactive element there too.
Yeah.
And with the foresight reports, how is it decided which topics to look at?
That's a difficult question. I think they because they're expensive, big projects, I think it's very much the Chief Scientific Advisors Network has a big part to play, as well as CST, and they kind of have a kind of decision, and they have a long list of potential projects, and they're just shortlisted down onto one. I think they try and run 2 at a time at any one time, and that's the ageing and the cities one. Previous ones were done on future of manufacturing, was the one done previous to that, which was published last year, the future of manufacturing. So they run at a time.
And there was a big foresight on energy around 2007.
Was there? Yes, I think there was. I can remember.
50 or 60 peer-reviewed papers came
yes.
and contributed.
Yes, so they're in.
Yeah. So it might be a little while before we get another one.
Yeah. On energy. They're mammoth. I mean, the cities one has travelled all around to many cities around the country. I think they visited about 20 different cities on a kind of roadshow type basis. So it's to get the evidence gathering in situ. So it's a huge amount of effort and work done.
And they have a big energy angle to those projects. So I mean, I don't think you need to wait for an energy focused one.
Yeah.
There's certainly a lot of energy in ageing work and in cities.
Yes. And like also on the Internet of Things, again, we don't lead on that, but there's a big energy angle, so we've inputted heavily on that. Jenny's done a lot of work on working with DEC on the Internet of Things, making sure DEC's involved in that.
Is there, the kind of things that you publish, does it include the interaction that the geoscience has with the government, with the cabinet and so on, or is it your independent papers only that are published?
Yes, everything that we publish is independent. I don't think there's anything...
That's not what I asked. Like, the kind of issues in which you advise the government, and what exactly is the kind of advice that
Right.
under the government, is that published? As
Now that is a good question, actually. That's some of the advice the Prime Minister does is confidential, obviously. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know whether Jenny can remember, but I think all the advice given on SAGE for the Emergencies Committee is published after the event. I believe so. I remember when I discussed with my colleagues, I think with my colleagues who did that, if I remember rightly, everything on SAGE is published on that after it's happened. So I'm not 100% certain, but I'm perhaps 90% certain on that.
case by case basis?
Yeah. I think we try for publication and openness wherever possible, because science is something that's open. I mean, despite its very nature, the whole nature of peer review and the nature of how academia works is on an open basis. And I think we're very much in that spirit. So if we can publish, we will publish. For example, on the Blackett reviews, which have security angles, all of that is published, except there's sometimes a security chapter that's not published alongside the main report, but the majority of it will be published, if we can.
And being open isn't just about the publications, so we're keen to talk to people, and one of the reasons why we're here today is to connect up government to people such as yourselves. So, so there's the publications, but there's also the wider element of open policy making.
So for instance, if members of faculty and the student bodies here at UCL feel like, based on your publications and information that's in the public, that something is of particular national interest, how does that get onto your agenda? Do they approach you, or do they approach the academies and societies for you then to get to you, to get to the government scientists and the council?
I mean, it could work either ways. I mean, we're always happy to be approached. And as I say, we don't cover the whole of science. Sir Mark, and when he came in, he's tended to go down the theme approach. So he hasn't to try and limit the kind of. We have more specialism, so we don't cover the whole of science. So we have special themes. If your news or something you want to broadcast falls within one of the themes, then the best thing is just to approach the person who leads the theme, like, for example, myself on energy. If it's in a more general topic, then just approaching Sir Mark's private office, and they will pass information on. He has his own private office team.
And the likelihood of you getting priority based on all the various tools that you use?
I mean, it'd be difficult to say, but everything that comes through us, we look at. We have more, most of the time, Jenny might smile a bit, most of the time we have more time to actually look at things than some of the policymakers. Not this week. This week's been very, very busy. Yes, yeah, this week's been very busy. A lot going on.
But yeah, we always try and respond. So I think normally we try and respond within a few weeks.
Yeah.
So I know that sounds like quite a long time. We do the best we can. We do get quite a bit of correspondence
coming
through. So things that come to Mark, then we'll reply on his behalf if he asks us to. And we get people do write to Mark quite a bit about energy and climate change.
Yeah, I mean, we got a lot of for example, a minister may get a letter from their constituent on a science issue. The minister might then want to ask Mark about that before he replies back to the constituent. So those are the kind of things we come in from ministers. So we deal with a very wide range of correspondence.
I was just wondering, because I saw that you started off by saying that the role of GOS is to provide ministers with an evidence base for this to make decisions. And I was just thinking, how does the Government Office of Science interact with some of the other departments that seem to have that role as well? So like the Government Economic Service and the Social Science Service, because I noticed that you've got that project on ageing, and I think you might imagine the Government Economic Service might also be working on ageing as well.
Yeah.
And
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I could have given more. I just didn't talk about that. But absolutely, we work very closely with those, and there is a regular meeting where all the heads of those different specialisms in government meet to go through that. So we'll have the head of the social science, the head of the economists, the head of the operational researchers, and Sir Mark will all meet on a regular basis to discuss key issues to make sure they are all coordinated. And things, certainly the big foresight projects will bring in expertise. A lot of them require, for example, social science and economic expertise, so we'll have to bring those in.
So does that mean that, so for the science that you're talking about, your team mainly made up of physical scientists, and then you distinguish that between the economists and the social scientists? Is that your themes are just?
Yes, I mean, most
decided what you get and what they get, I guess, in terms of projects.
I mean, we wouldn't be dictating what projects the economists or social scientists, it's science-led, but we will bring in the kind of expertise of our colleagues on an as and when basis. So the majority of the people working in GoScience are scientists or engineers, I think, to a very large extent. Is that right?
Yes, I guess, yes, that's probably true.
I think we have a couple of people who on the foresight who are more on the social science side, don't we? Have a couple of people in that team.
Certainly increasingly our projects do tend to involve a social science element, energy, behavioural aspects are really important for, as you all know, for energy policy. So it is a major part of what we're doing, and as Rupert says, we do work closely with to take. We do work closely with colleagues across government who have those kinds of expertise and outside of government too.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things. I mean, do you put like calls for evidence in the way that when other departments are doing a consultation or does it not work that way?
I mean, absolutely there is calls for evidence. When we do one of those kind of, it depends on the type of project. Our projects don't, the ones we do in the energy team, because they're working with a particular learned society, so we wouldn't. But for example, the Blackett reviews on Internet of Things, that definitely had a call for evidence. All the big foresight projects certainly do. They go outside so people know that they are meant to contribute to it. I mean, so for example, on the Internet of Things, although I just lead on the energy part, I gave a talk at that just last week on the Internet of Things, and again, that was to a wide range of people from industry and academia, and I specifically said to them, you know, this is going on, and this is how you can contribute. So we try and get the message out as broadly as we can, but learning societies are a good way of doing that a lot of the time.
Societies you work with from the energy perspective?
For energy, we work very closely with the Royal Academy of Engineering, we work with Royal Society, we work with the British Academy, for example, as well. I guess those are three main ones. Then we work with groups like the Institution of Engineering and Technology, increasingly at the moment. It doesn't have to be just those people, but we've worked a lot with them in the past.
Yep. I mean, because it's Sir Mark's very interested in the social science side, which was just discussed. So the project we did, which wasn't done by me, but was done by my predecessor, was done on the geological disposal of nuclear waste, and there was a project that we did with the British Academy looking at the social science aspect of community engagement with the deep geological disposal of nuclear waste, and that report came out, was actually published July, I think. It was done previously, it took a long time for it to get published, but yes, it's now published and that's available. So that's the kind of moving more into the social science space. So we can't, well, I mean, the people running it in GoScience are scientists, but we would rely on the British Academy to get the social science aspect in for that. And the one that Jenny's doing at the moment as well, one of the ones we're doing on the follow-on from the capacity margin, is social science and economics as well. And Jenny's been working very closely with the experts in that area to get the necessary expertise. And I think you've learned quite a lot about the academic community in that social science area, haven't you, over the last few months?
Very interesting.
Oh, sorry.
I was just interested in the kind of changes if there are ways to get more.
Yes, I mean, the ways we have internships in GoScience, so we have people coming in as interns into GoScience. I think those are advertised most job opportunities across the civil service are advertised on the jobs portal on gov.uk, so you get internships will be advertised then, and then there are of course also advertised on gov.uk direct entry into jobs in the civil service for people who are interested in jobs in the civil service. And there's also the fast stream I mentioned before, which we're looking at people with PhDs to come into government.
Someone else asked a question.
Okay, do you have a question? Okay, back to you.
I was interested in the neutrality aspect that you were stressing. Like you, again, in the social science stream of things, you read about how government often uses the science on as a kind of shield for its policy writing. I don't know if this is like the appropriate forum to ask you about this, but do you often find yourself the government does?
I don't see us as a shield.
No.
So I see your point, but I don't think we're that way. I mean, it's true that ministers have an incredibly difficult job to do. They have to. I think Rupert brought up the point about lenses before, and there are all these different factors that might affect your decision. So you might have cultural issues to think about, you might have security issues, and technical issues will be one aspect of what they need to consider. And we provide, well, the Government Office of Science, and specifically the Chief Scientist, provide advice to inform that aspect of their decisions. But what ministers are doing is much wider, so I never feel that we're a shield. But
No, because they have to take into account so many different aspects when they're deciding which policy route to take. Science is only one of them. So when we're talking about scientific evidence of policy making, we don't say this is the right answer. We say that these are the options you've got and these are the possible consequences of taking those various options. It's then up to the ministers to decide which is the best route as they are the elected representatives. All that we're doing is just making sure that from a science perspective that they know how and what kind of science context they're making those decisions in.
But like from say, from media's point of view, from the public point of view, I mean, what I'm trying to ask is, do you have to engage with the media and so on to convince them that, just what you told me, is that something that you have to do often?
I think the Chief Scientist engages the media a lot. I don't know if you've seen him on, you might have heard him on the Today programme. He certainly does quite a few interviews in a range of areas. I don't think the reason that he's doing that is as a sort of shield thing to sort of defend issues. I think it's more because he's very keen that the public's informed about major issues, and it's only if people understand the trade-offs that are made for things like energy that that ministers can be empowered to make those decisions. So
Yes.
I think that's more the reason why we're very keen on public engagement and why we're keen on engagement. I don't know if I've quite answered your question.
I mean, he wouldn't defend a policy decision. For example, I think a very sensitive one, for example, is like the badger cull around bovine TV, which is a very sensitive policy area, and it wouldn't be appropriate for the chief scientist to get involved in what policy decision was taken. However, he would be quite happy, and I think he has done, talking on radio or in the press about the scientific evidence around bovine TB and badgers being a carrier of it and what it means from a science perspective, but he wouldn't be defending the minister's decision on the course of action that was taken. But he would be quite happy, and I think he would be quite right, to educate the public around the science that's led to the decision by the minister, but he wouldn't be involved in defending that decision. It wouldn't be his role to do that. That's the minister's role to do that.
Sorry now. Okay, so you first then, David.
To what scale do you communicate with international governments, so maybe even departments in the US? You mentioned deep geological disposal, and I know the US have done a lot of research and put a lot of money into that, and whether you can learn from them.
We do try to. It's just time limitation. So where there's a particular good evidence base from overseas, we will work with overseas experts, for example, on shale gas, unconventional oil and gas. I've done quite a lot of work with that, with the Americans, had quite a few video conferences with the Americans to learn from their experiences on unconventional oil and gas, which can then be brought to bear in the UK space. So where possible, we do it. It's just a resource limitation. So I think I would like to do more internationally. We do an awful lot of focus with engagement with UK experts. I think we could do more if we had time to do more with international experts as well on the subject matters, to bring to bear their experience.
And it's also worth saying that we're obviously just we're one place in government that looks at evidence collection, but all the different departments are of course also doing more focused evidence collection on specific topics, and they also speak to international colleagues in a range of areas too.
Yeah. We're doing a lot more engagement with FCO and DFID. DFID is very good. They do a lot of research. A lot of people don't realise how much the Department of International Development, sorry, I'm using acronyms, Department of International Development, they do a lot of research, and theirs is all overseas. It's not UK based. So in our team, we're trying to link up much more closely with the science team in DFID to bring together, because they've already got the international perspective. So by bringing it on board, I think we can get quite a lot of use from kind of liaison on that perspective.
And of course, you already mentioned the Science Innovation Network, which is across government, located with colleagues from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and various different embassies, I suppose, across the world, and they're a very strong resource.
Yeah. I mean, they just facilitated a meeting just on Friday I attended, where the director of the Argonne National Laboratory in the US came over, and we went to a meeting on energy storage to discuss on the UK policy framework on energy storage. So that's another international example of some of the work that we do internationally.
A question about the coordinating roles. Individual departments coordinate pieces of work in support of evaluating policies and evidence base. And a lot of time there are issues, particularly in the energy field in our area, which kind of sit on the borders between different government departments, like DCLG and DEG and things like that. Does GoScience actually play a role in, if we start trying to get a kind of oversight of the work that's done in individual departments and making sure there isn't duplication? And is there any role in, if you like, quite adjudicating between departments, because I'm sure departments will get into such situations, but are there situations where you would play a role of basically saying, we think this piece of work is more closely aligned with this department than the other department?
I don't think we would necessarily directly influence departments in that way, but we do an important coordination role, and I think Jenny can describe some of the stuff you did on bioenergy, which is a really good example of coordinating evidence collection.
So, I think we work with departments rather than tell departments to do stuff. It's much more, we find it's much more constructive to work with them with that. And on bioenergy, it's one of those topics that crosses a lot of different areas, and we were keen to avoid duplication and make sure that departments were connected on that. So we set up a bioenergy group, bringing together policy leads, economists, scientists across government who work on these issues to help them collaborate on evidence collection and make sure that all the evidence that they had plans to collect all the evidence they needed. So I think we would work in that way, bringing them together so that they can work together to avoid duplication.
Yes. I mean, if they find out that there are people doing the same thing, government departments, under so much resource pressure, they're quite happy. Once we find out that someone else is doing that, they're quite happy to say, okay, fine, we're not going to do that, because they just want to save their own money. So I think it's mainly once we get them talking, and that's the main thing, because policy people are so busy. Once we get the people brought together in various departments, they tend to naturally want to avoid duplication, which is good kind of saving across government of resources.
And I mean, if there's anything seriously to worry about, our role is to work with them, but also if anything really major, we raise it to the chief scientist.
And then he would speak to the department's chief scientist as how that's how that would work. So we'd take it up and then it would go across and back down. If that happened. It doesn't really happen that too much.
I mean, we would normally prefer to work with departments to get to solutions.
Rather than having
so long as well, that's appropriate, rather than just
we've never had
straight to the chief scientist.
We've never had to do that. Just to stress, we've never had to do that.
Okay, I'd be very interested to know, and this is maybe one to tuck away and just email back afterwards. What are your hardest unanswered open questions? As we have dozens of PhD students arriving all the time, particularly if you've got things that don't necessarily need an answer this afternoon because the minister's about to speak on it. But if you have hard unanswered open questions, we'd really like to know about that, because maybe we can put things in place to get those answered for you, and whether there are specific gaps in expertise where you know it's been particularly hard to find particular expertise in the energy field.
Yes.
We'd be very interested to hear that.
It's difficult to think of anything off the top of our head.
I want to take that away.
We have to take that away. I'll take that away. Yeah, we'll do it. We'll get back to that. I'll get back to you on that one.
Do we have any more questions? We
No,
do.
Never mind, just general. I'm also just getting acquainted with the Go Science area. Could you share the slide so that we have easier navigation through that labyrinth of...
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Yeah.
And the presentation will be on our YouTube site as well.
Okay.
In that case, thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.
Would you join me in thanking our presenters?
Thank you.